I would advise to start, so I'll be happy to start the last talk actually of today. We'll have an, I think, quick but really interesting journey. We'll guide you from the modding support. So we'll start with the reverse engineering and come to the in-game tools, guiding you through different aspects of this specific area of the game development, which is a modding support and architectures of it. We will deliver the talk for you, so I will just introduce briefly ourselves. I'm Michał Szklarski, and since 2001 I created numerous mods, starting from the Elder Scrolls 3 game, and my first mods in 2001 actually, then got some bigger ones, actually created one of the first unofficial multiplayers from GRFT Outo 5 called GTMP, then server out of it and the community out of it, and recently with Juliusz we are creating a tech for the modding support, which we will cover various scenarios and architectures later on. And Juliusz.
Yes, and I come from more of a game developer background. One of the games that I worked on had modding support that we added, Total Tank Simulator. And recently, as Michael mentioned, we run a company that actually helps game developers add modding support to games.
As simple as that. So let's start with the introduction. And just before the introduction, quick question to you. Which game engine is it? Any guesses? Okay, that's the funniest answer. Yeah, I got that one. It was closer to none. Actually, it's a Roblox studio. So it's a tool, actually a creator tool that enables one of the recent powerhouses for the UGCs or a Roblox platform. So the players can create their own maps, their own content. And actually, Roblox is a platform that you can only play on the custom-made content. People are even role-playing church masses. It was a common fact, and videos on YouTube were deployed recently, so you had more on that. But yeah, exactly, it's something that is trending, and it gains right now. Roblox has over 15 million peak players per day, so it's a huge thing right now. Second question, another example, Starfield released, the game premiere was at the 6th of September 2023, so quite recently, like about 1 month ago. Question to you, how many mods were available to download on this exact date, game premiere date? Zero would seem like a natural answer, but reality is just about that. 450 mods was already created at the date of the game premiere, which helped that this game was released in early access 1 week before that. So modders without any tools, any support, created numerous mods to that game prior to the game release. Hell, they even released the DLSS support for the NVIDIA graphic cards, because the official and the standard version of the game has a support for the AMD solutions. So yeah, someone needed to do the work for the NVIDIA cards, and this mod is working flawlessly until today. So yeah. The talk again that will guide you through today will start with some sense and give you some explanation about the mod classification, because there is no single meaning of the word mod. Then we will present you some wild examples of the mods that are available to be downloaded for the different games. And finally, most beefy tech part, modding support architectures, which approaches are interesting, which might be difficult or dangerous sometimes. And about that danger thing, we will guide you through avoiding a common modding support pitfalls and mistakes that can be made through it. And we'll summarize it, make some final thoughts, and that's it. There is a party after that, so yeah. Then let's start with the sense and the actual mod classification. So I will give Juliusz this part.
The token, okay. So as Michael mentioned, our approach is to perceive mods as something wide, like perhaps some purists would argue that, unless you reverse engineer a game or change the game without the support from the game developer, that's not mods. But for the purpose of this talk, we understand mods to be a wide spectrum of things. And first of all, mods vary wildly in terms of their complexity and what they actually affect. So, starting with some very simple things, sometimes, literally single value tweaks, up until total conversions, which are effectively ripping out the original game and replacing it with something sometimes quite different from the original. So that's one axis to have in mind. And secondly, there are different approaches to integration path between mods and the game. So starting with the kind of historically the only approach, which was reverse engineering, where the community does all the work, all the way through repackaged tools that were used to make the game. So something like releasing a game engine editor in some way and source code and source project. Then maybe dedicated tools, and finally in-game tools and editors. And of course there are differences here. We'll talk about that. So why is this important? Well, because as a game developer, modding support is something you have to design for the size of your audience. So the same approaches that work for huge AAA games with tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of users, might not work for you. So a large game production can rely on talented reverse engineers to create the foundations for the content that then come after that. But the same approach will not work for more of an indie title, even a very successful one, because it's not reasonable to expect that let's say every other player of your game will have the technical ability to, for instance, reverse engineer the game, or even handle something as complex as a game engine editor. So what you want to do is not land in this kind of pit of despair area where the complexity of the tools that you shipped is maybe not adequate to the size of your audience and their kind of composition. So that's why this is important. Now pass it to Michael to show us some examples.
Exactly. Show some examples of the mods that we have, starting from the categorization that we had presented earlier on. Total conversions on the mods that are aiming to, on a game engine or on a game, recreate or add practically make another game out of this game and out of these tools that they have. The best example, I think, out of possibly many ones, this is the Enderal mod, and there are the Shards of the Order, and this is a mod for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the most long-life game until now and released practically on every platform, but you know that. So this mod adds an practically different world, different map, different quest lines, different factions. So it's another game based on top of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and its engine called Creation Engine. Then there are community DLCs, so the mods that are aiming to create, add, enhance, but based on the original game that they are enhancing on, building on. So this is just only an extension of some aspect of the game. And the perfect example is A Night to Remember mod for The Witcher 3, which adds on like 8 hours of additional gameplay, a few additional quests and choices to be made on the original game narrative line. Then there are mods that adds or enhances some existing or not existing game mechanics to the original game. And this is the Traffic Manager mod for the city skylines that exactly gives you an opportunity to create your own perfect roundabouts, drive your traffic through various complicated scenarios and design every part of it. And finally, map mods, something smaller, more simpler, but giving you an opportunity to enhance and play the game in a way that it gives you another, let's say, level or another way to play the game. Realcraft map for the StarCraft 2 is a perfect example that adds an tower defense mod to the original StarCraft 2, and also there is a multiplayer capability shipped to that. And then there are the content mods, so adding some specific things, specific items, let's say, or items for the character. A perfect example, for Tropico 6, there is a mod that adds a video game factory that takes the local workforce and produces a game in some places of the time, so you are able to get additional revenue from your, like, tropical island and the dictatorship that you are throwing out here. So this is kind of an example of the community-made building. Quality of life and tweaks, also very important part of the modding, because maybe it's not so big like the mod categories that we had earlier on, but it actually in most of the cases saves the game. This is the mod already put into some nice interface called Starfield Tweaker that was released a few days after the game premiere. That gives you an interface to tweak every parameter of the original game graphic and physics engine. So you can practically tweak and customize every element for that game to be tailored for your PC and your configuration to run smoothly on this configuration. Okay, let's talk about mod support architectures and the way that people are able to do those examples and implement tooling for the communities to, produce the things that we showed just in a moment ago.
Yeah, so we'll start with, reverse engineering. So essentially an approach where the community does all the work. They reconstruct parts of the source project that was, used to ship the game. And really, we have to first of all talk about a big distinction, which is dependent on the game engine and the scripting kind of runtime that's used to execute your game. So with managed code, so things like Unity without IL2CPP enabled. It's much easier. We're not really going to talk about that today much. The only thing just because of the time constraints, but the only thing here to say is that because managed code has a lot more structure in it, it's actually much easier to get sources that are basically very close to the original. With native code, it's more complicated than that. So there are two approaches that the community can use to kind of take a bite at your game and to try to kind of figure out how it works, and then eventually build this library that others can then use to enhance the game. So first approach is static analysis. So this is approach where you take the executable of the game and using one of the disassembly tools, you can poke at the structure, look at the structure and look for patterns, things like beginnings of methods, things like calls to, for instance, operating system routines. And then you have another approach, which is dynamic analysis, and those approaches really kind of feed into each other. So with dynamic analysis, you actually run the game and then you observe, the side effects. The main side effect here is really, what appears in the memory. You can look for specific values that, for instance, are something meaningful to you, like, I don't know, a number of bullets in a chamber in an FPS game. So static analysis, it is, I would say equal parts art and science. The steps that this involves are complicated by the fact that executables that the community tries to reverse engineer are already result of multiple optimization passes, and therefore a lot of stuff will be obfuscated kind of naturally. For instance, you can have calls that were inlined, you can have some quite obscure CPU instructions used just to speed things up. Still, it's possible to use disassembly tools such as IDA Pro is, I guess, considered kind of a industry standard, but there are also open source alternatives like Ghidra, and those will allow you to first of all see the assembly, not the machine code, and then The high level way this works is the code gets split into kind of those basic blocks, which end with a jump instruction of some sort, and that do not have jumps in the middle. I would say the way to think about it is that the result is a bit similar to a visual scripting program, and then you can try to look for patterns. You can look for loops and things like that. And on the other hand, the approach that feeds into this, especially that an executable for a AAA game can be very large and can contain, be a result basically of compiling millions and millions of lines. So to get yourself started, you have to look for something that's maybe around what you're looking for. And one way here is to use dynamic analysis. So a use case, I guess, would be useful. So for instance, in an FPS game, you could have a specific number of bullets in your chamber. Let's say 123 bullets. And then it's reasonable to assume that somewhere in the game's memory there will be this value stored. And you can scan the entire memory that belongs to the game, and you can try to find this number. You will get some false positives inevitably. But with then maybe some iteration, shooting and seeing how the values react, you can probably arrive at the value that you were looking for, and then you can set up some breakpoints and maybe see which parts of the code actually write and which parts of the code read from that cell in memory. And probably if it's shooting, then it has something to do with that. So that's kind of a starting point for your static analysis. So ultimately, what's the goal? The goal is to build something so that you don't have to reverse engineer anymore. So you want to build essentially a library that will provide, entry points that will redefine data structures that the game use, and then the community will be able to build on top of that.
Yeah, and the perfect example of that is Grand Theft Auto 5, which was released many years ago, and not so long after that, it was reverse engineered by different teams, and the utility called ScriptCook 5 was provided, and it practically enables you to create your own modification, as shown here. In about 200 lines of code, you are able to create and customize your own speedometer that enables you to show the speed and some parameters of the vehicle. So it's just an interesting example of how pure code and these APIs based on top of the approach that Juliusz mentioned is used to provide some useful things starting from the speedometers.
All right. So, what are the different sides of this approach? Well, first of all, it's very low effort for the game developer, high effort for the community. And because this is kind of an uncontrolled approach, there are no limitations to what can be modded. If people are smart enough, they can figure it out, which can be bad as well, because of compatibility and reliability issues. One thing to note here is that this approach will always be slow to start. Somebody has to do the groundwork of building the modding APIs that the rest of the community can use, and that will take highly skilled people who are into that kind of stuff. They see that as a challenge. One thing that is maybe not so common to understand is that if you have inevitably crashes and compatibility issues because of mods, for the players that then consume the mods, it might not be always clear whether it's the base game that crashed or is it the fault of the mod itself. Therefore, they might actually blame you for something that's not your fault. Okay, so that kind of concludes the reverse engineering. Let's talk about kind of a next step, which is using approach which we called DevTools repackaged. So basically in this approach, you take your source project and you cut it down perhaps to some extent, and then you release that source project to your community, and that's the toolkit that people will be using to create more content to your game. This is kind of a compromise. It's definitely lower effort for the community. They don't have to, hack your game using disassembly tools anymore. So that part is out. But on the other hand, it requires some work from the game developer, but not as much as some other approaches we'll be talking about later.
For Tropico 6, an excellent example of that approach, shipped by the original game developer. The official and the only solution to create the mods is the Unreal Editor, which is kind of a little bit only cut down of the features, but still overloaded with the features that with inappropriate approach can break some game mechanics or other things. So all in the end, it's a full Unreal Editor that for sure is used and enables you to create a custom map for the Tropico 6, but still though it's way too powerful, and those changes sometimes can be obviously it won't change global elements, but up to some extent it can break much more things that it was originally planned to do with. For the Dying Light 2, the editor that was shipped here as an called developer tools, it's also such kind of an editor, but way more feature was cut down from it to provide simplified interface for the map modding.
Okay, so some sides of this approach. So as we mentioned, much less labor intensive. The whole reverse engineering thing is out. It is a good approach to target technically able modders who are either maybe coming from game development background themselves, or maybe they are just advanced hobbyists. On the other hand, of course, these are not all people who are interested in creating content. They are still have to be quite technically minded to handle something like a game engine editor. And this approach doesn't prevent compatibility or reliability issues. There are a lot of options available in a game engine editor that you don't want really people to use, because that will not necessarily work. And some of them will just not do anything, because the part that gets then packaged and shipped as a mod doesn't contain even those settings that they can change, so it can be confusing. As another point, it's important to understand that this approach, even though it's a middle ground, it doesn't come for free. Especially as time comes by, you probably want mods for your game to remain functional. You cannot really expect people to maintain them on the same level they would, if they were your employees. And to make that possible, since you shipped, your entire source project or a large part of it, the surface of that tool is quite large, and therefore to maintain compatibility might be quite difficult. There might be a lot of technical debt coming from that. Okay, so next approach, more of a dedicated tool that was built specifically for modders. This approach is quite different because the editing tool that the community will be using, it's something that is no longer a game engine editor in this case. In some, and here we arrive at what I would describe as the traditional highly moddable game architecture. This is what people often think about when thinking about modding and having a game that was designed for modding from the very beginning. So in this approach, we have two parts. We have the base game that contains sort of the very basic rules of the game that are not going to be subject to change. And then we have the editing tool that allows us to, author either custom scripts or custom content for the game. Oftentimes, in this approach, base game is very limited. Even the core mechanics of the game, some of the arguably core mechanics of the game, are written using the same approach as the mods employ. And to be able to, for those two things to communicate, you need something, some kind of a medium for them to communicate, and that medium is a set of formats for storing game data. It's often a embedded scripting solution is involved, such as Lua. And this approach introduces this concept of kind of a modding API, one could say. So something that provides a boundary between, what is the, let's say, operating system of the game and what is the content and behaviors that are plugged into it using mods.
Yet another example of such kind of an approach is StarCraft 2 Galaxy Editor, so a specialized toolkit that practically, as shown earlier, Realcraft map was created only on that. It's not only a map editing and asset placement tool, but also a scripting tool and behavior tool. So the maps and the things that we can create are practically not so much limited. Scripting and providing additional capabilities or adding or modifying parameters of the object looks usually like that. So it's an editing of the XML files or configuration files, but it works for this game. The another, I'd say, practically most popular example, creation kit tools for this game. There is Course 5 Skyrim in this example, Bethesda games in general. The editor looks like that. It's my simple mod that adds some building to the game, but it enables you to place, edit any type of an asset into the given game location that you are selecting. On the left side, asset list, every asset in the game that's available is shown here. Obviously, not only that, you can import, you can add your own assets, you can create your own dialogue lines, your own quests, and give those lines an additional voice acting just by importing those files here. Another example, Eurotrack Simulator 2. Those tools are made to provide complex traffic rules, design whole roundabouts, whole crossroads, and practically every scenario that you can map into that. Parameters editing looks like that, very much complex, enabling you to edit any parameter of the track or any asset in the game. It works because it's a powerhouse tool. Yeah.
All right. So with this approach, the biggest upside from the perspective of modders is that they receive a specialized tool for the game. So there are no longer buttons that, in the game engine editor do nothing. From their perspective, they get a tool that is definitely easier to learn because its structure follows the game itself. You get a solution that's also more reliable going forward. There is, a smaller surface area, and there is actually a kind of a cleaner boundary between mods and the base game. So that makes it easier to maintain without much of a sacrifice. On the other hand, the biggest downside from the perspective of developer is that it is a lot of work. Essentially, you're shipping a whole another product that's adding on top of your game working. And this approach can lead to non-standard workflows. And by that I mean that since for the purpose of modding, you might be forced to re-implement some of the features that the game engine provides out of the box to make them more of a plugin, compatible with kind of this plugin moddable architecture. That might mean that, especially if you're planning on using the same modding tools for your own team, that might mean that you have to educate them from scratch how to use those tools. And also, this also means that you might be forced to first create the tools And then only when the tools are stabilized, you can kind of get into the step 2, which is creating the actual game. It's not difficult to see that, this approach can feel a little bit like building on quicksand. If, by creating the game itself, you discover that some of the features that you had in your, let's say, framework for building the game is missing. So that's something to keep in mind. And finally, we arrive at in-game modding tools and editors. So with these tools, there is no external application, there is no another executable. And this approach is the most controlled. Everything happens from within the game. But on the other hand, this approach is definitely the most player-friendly. It's ultimately the goal here can be to make modding as approachable, as fun as playing the base game itself. So how to make that happen? Well, you can try to use the same kind of traditional architecture for modding the game. You can still have your base game. You can still have your part of the game that's the editing tools that are this time built into the game itself. You can still employ the interchange, but since those two parts are really the same executable, this approach can be actually a little bit of a overkill, and there are some other ways to approach it. So one such approach is to introduce a modding orchestration library. So the approach here is to have a component of your game which purpose is to integrate the content that comes with the game built in and the content that comes from mods. And in essence, the content that's built in is authored and is created using the same workflows and the same tools that the game engine itself provides. On the other hand, the content and the scripting that comes from mods is implemented using different structures and using a different scripting solution. And the purpose of the modding orchestration library is to integrate those two things together so that the base game doesn't have to make a distinction between the source of those two things. So that is kind of an alternate approach. Here it is kind of in a, let's say, diagram form. So what's the upside of this solution? The upside of the solution is that because it integrates with or has more knowledge about what mods contain, it doesn't treat them as kind of black boxes. It can also be used to detect conflicts between mods and to understand which mods can work together and in what order they should be loaded. With this approach, it's actually much easier to add modding support at a late stage of game development. It's no longer something that has to be planned ahead of time, especially given that a lot of games aren't really sure whether modding is something that they would be interested in before the game starts selling and before you can see what kind of feedback and what kind of interest you have from the community of players. The team that creates the base gameplay can use the standard workflows that are used by the game engine. So we no longer have to express the content that ships with the game using some custom designed formats, such as text files or kind of open formats that were meant for modding. We can use the built-in ones. The orchestration modding library is the one that integrates those two pieces together. This can also help with performance, especially given that re-implementing portions of the game engine to support a kind of deep modding can be a risk, especially if you get into things like loading a lot of small text files. That can be something that, for instance, Windows operating system hates with a passion. Because there is this clean boundary between the base game and the content that comes from mods, you can have more flexibility with evolving the base game underneath without breaking compatibility with mods. So some examples of both approaches, both the traditional one and the modding orchestration one.
Exactly. Here in the game that was released, it's not a young game. It's not a young game, but a really popular game, Age of Empires 2. This is the example of the traditional approach and the in-game map editor based on top of that. That not only enables you to create your own custom maps, but provide custom logic for that map. So action-reaction trigger system in that. Another example, Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, that obviously prime example of modding capabilities is to create your own roller coasters and test it with some virtual people or not. So one of the main editors for the game is the roller coaster editor. This is also a traditional modding API approach. The new approach will allow you to do something in a different way, sometimes in a more advanced way. This is the approach that was taken in the Postal Brain Damage game, that not only via interface will enable you to place, edit, modify, utilize some features like undo, redo, and more advanced just in the game and test it instantly in the game, but also will give you a set of tutorials for the players to get more easier to do your own maps, do your own custom asset placement on that maps. It's just a multi-step tutorial that really nicely guides you through that approach and that editor.
All right. So some of the downsides and upsides here. So in general, in-game editors are the easiest, the most accessible option for the audience. So they are quite well suited for games that are indie games that sell in hundreds of thousands rather than tens of millions. This approach, of course, is also more limiting, so it's a trade-off. Because this is a very controlled approach and everything is shipped with the game, this provides more of more security and stability. It's the mods are, also in the eyes of the players, more integrated into the game and more of a part of the game. It's not kind of an optional thing that's easier to maybe forget about. But also that means that from the perspective of players, mods become, especially the modding tools, become something that should reach a higher level of quality. So when you have an external tool, maybe it's easier to and more okay, quote unquote, to assume that players will not be angry if those editing tools have some instabilities or display weird messages, error messages. With tools that are built into the game, really the level of quality that you ship should be more in line with the game itself, and it's quite clear that players are very demanding in terms of the quality that they require. It is an approach with orchestration library, or especially with the traditional approach. It is approach that still requires a lot of work from the developer, but it can actually be substantially easier compared to the external tool, where the entirety of content and scripting that gets created for the game has to be transported between those two completely separate tools, so the game itself and the editor. Because here this lives in the single executable, some of the interchange can be done more easily. Okay, so now we will arrive at some of the considerations and some pitfalls to try to avoid. So the number one issue with mods, and that's by a long shot, is mods breaking after the game updates. This can be, especially common with reverse engineering approach for obvious reasons. The game itself, really, the entirety of it is kind of considered public in this approach. Therefore, you cannot really guarantee anything to be implementation detail as far as the game is concerned. As far as the reverse engineering is concerned, everything is public. And okay, what can be done about it? So if we want more stability for mods, if we want mods not to break, then the way to accomplish it is to treat them more like plugins. And that means having some kind of a modding API, so some kind of a boundary that's defined between mods. Of course, with reverse engineering, that's not possible, but with some other approaches, such as the external tools that are dedicated for the game, or with the in-game build editors, that approach is possible. So if there is an API, then you can actually treat it like an API. The other day we spoke with the creator of Factorio, and they actually issue version updates with change sets, and this way they kind of make sure that mods get updated to newer versions. The second most popular issue with mods is mods conflicting with each other, and that's for a variety of reasons. It's one of the common issues is, for instance, load order. It's easy to imagine that, for instance, if one mod is adding an item to the game and another mod is changing all the items in the game in some specific way, then the order of those operations matter. The way to address this one is to try to give mods more structure. So to understand, not treat mods as black boxes, but instead try to make sure that mods contain all the metadata, such as, what entry points they rely on, what versions of other mods maybe they rely on, what kind of changes are they even making. The more information we have, the more the easier can we configure the system in such a way that mods are, for instance, automatically applied in the right order, and instead of just arbitrary order. Another issue is security. So this issue really is addressed today in a kind of reactive way. So the kind of dominant approach is that certain mod hosting platforms mostly try to prevent virus distribution by having quite aggressive scans of mods that are posted, but this approach is not bulletproof, since it can only possibly detect viruses that are already in the wild, and if somebody creates something novel and then by just definition this approach cannot work to detect such a malware that was authored specifically for your game. Of course, the bigger the game, the more this matters. And the approach here is really to this only applies to kind of more officially supported mods, but the approach here is to first of all, for formats that are used for keeping mod data, they have to be kind of assumed to be untrusted, and you cannot assume, for instance, that if the file format declares that a block of data after it is a certain length, that it really is going to be the certain length. You have to make sure all those kind of loading routines are hardened and tested against kind of common attack vectors. And for code execution, which is, I guess the most obvious kind of attack vector here, you kind of have to use some kind of a sandbox execution, such as Lua or another non-native execution kind of scripting solution. And finally, one common issue is performance, and this one is especially affecting the approach where the game itself is written using the same architecture that is then made available to modders. And the reason for that is that basically with this traditional moddable game architecture, you are going to reinvent some of the optimizations or some of the features of the game engine, and therefore you would also need to reinvent some of the optimizations that are commonly used by game engines. For instance, I mentioned small files, or if there is a scripting solution, there might be a cost to interop, and that can be quite expensive and can add up. The way to address this one is really to, for instance, for the content, the approach might be to batch logic. For content, it might be to put content in archives and load those rather than small files. For logic, it might be batching batching calls to mod logic, so that you don't pay this interop costs multiple times, but maybe rather just once per frame. Okay, some final thoughts now.
Exactly. So some final thoughts regarding what we said to you today and what we gave as an overview in the modding area of the game development is actually first important rule: don't be like that. Don't be like an extra set of information that guys are requiring to you to just to start get modding games. Like, for example, when the editor is launching, click yes to all warnings that you got. Those warnings will be numerous, so you need to click for all of them. There are some examples that are doing that, or another, my fun one, that you need to provide specific config in the editor configuration file that prevents 99% of the all crashes in that specific editor. Don't ask the guy that actually not invented, but detected that it just works and it's beautiful and the editor works, so why bother? So don't ship things like that, because the community, obviously, if they must, they will do it, but it's not kind of like a way to expand that modding area. Be like this, provide the community people editors that will be another mode of play, will enhance only the game and make them an environment and the platform to build upon it, not like a bugged tool or an experience that rather make those people run away from your game when it comes to such a fragile area as modding. So exactly, final consideration, ultimately, one of the most important things here: plan mod support, mod architecture for the size of your community, for the size and the scale of your game. Obviously, choose the architecture wisely. It's like on the diagram that we explained earlier on the game. If your game is an indie, if you provide an hard-to-use tools, external editors, there won't be much of it. If your game is big enough, you might experiment with any other approach. But obviously, in the majority of the cases, in-game, simplified, some usually most intuitive tools are the headshot approach, so it will work for most of the cases, as shown on the examples as bigger hits as Age of Empires, or smaller indie games, such as some examples mentioned before. So to that, some takeaways: there is no single meaning of the word mod. There are multiple ways to define mods for the game. We moved very much away from the original meaning of hacking the game, cheat engines and tools like that, to the meaning that mod can be sometimes like an enderal, total conversion that will create another game on top of another game. So the another example is the Forgotten City, which started as a mod for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and it ended up as an independent production made in Unreal Engine, a different story, the same people, modders that professionalized. So there is that also. Modding support can be added at a later stage, but it needs a specific architecture approach called the modding orchestration that Juliusz stated earlier on. So not only, and you don't need to fix on the approach that you need to plan and maintain later on, but plan from the day zero the modding and the editing capabilities to your game. You can add it later on, but the architecture needs to be more modern than the traditional approach. And ultimately, finally, if you approach modding right for your community, for your overall audience, it can keep your game alive for a long, long time. Just look at the Half-Life 2, look at the Skyrim, look at even smaller games that are benefiting from the modding capabilities like Factorio. So it's just like that. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all that we got for today. There is a party soon, so you can go drink now. If you want to get to know more about us, the approaches, the architecture, just scan the QR code that you have here. But thank you once again. It was a pleasure to speak here. So maybe you got some questions because we got a little bit of time. Oh, there is a mic coming for you. So.
What about consoles? What is allowed and what is not there?
Okay, I'll take this one. So with consoles, one important limitation, and actually we discussed this with somebody today, is that you're not allowed to use, for instance, just-in-time compilation. So it matters a lot what kind of execution you use. However, the approach that works is interpretation. So we know of examples of games which use basically, something like Python or Lua to have, code from mods being executed on consoles. So that's like one thing. There are some limitations from the technological point of view. The second thing I would add to this is that on consoles, you have to use a mod distribution platform that's compatible with them. I guess currently the main one is mod.io. And the reason is that consoles have very specific requirements about moderation for mods. You cannot just allow people to upload anything and make this right away available. Somebody has to do moderations, platforms that are compatible with consoles. They do typically employ some kind of waterfall of moderation there. Like sometimes there's some automated part of the moderation, and then there's some actual human checking on those mods.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Oh, just one.
Thank you guys for your presentation. You mentioned, I think, a lot of points about like when to integrate with mods. Like, you mentioned mod orchestration. It can come at a later stage of the game, etc. When would you recommend game developers to start think about like, including modding in their content strategy? Is it like at the beginning before you start developing, or is it okay if you can like just figure out later on that I cannot develop content, maybe I should give it to the community? It's like, what would you recommend as a strategy to kind of like, include modding?
So yeah, I will take that one. In some cases, it depends of the genre and the type of your game. Obviously, for some types of the games that are like RTS, strategies, city builders, RPGs, right now it's a no-brainer that you need some kind of a feature for the game to be a real platform to be, and sandboxes. Yeah, like games like Grand Theft Auto, Bethesda games. You know that from day zero you need to have this specific set of features, the modding inside of the game. For the rest of the game, it might come up as some kind of a nice to have feature, but obviously it will also enhance your game if planned earlier than later, but obviously it can be shipped later with an appropriate architectures. For example, for the narrative games, more narrative, let's say, or FPSs, you have like, one set of the maps, you have one, let's say, line that you are going through, finishing the game, and what after that, practically. So to make that game to live longer, provide more fun for the players, such kind of a feature, map editors, level editors, will just make that game, practically way more live-along game. So it's something that you need to, you need to plan also for that. The another thing is, I think that for this type of the tools, for the editors and for the modding tools, you are also, this is kind of an idea, but we got many requests about that. You are also able to implement those tools in your internal workflows earlier on in the process of game development. So if you, for example, plan and implement a map editor, a level editor early on, maybe just after the alpha or the beta stage, you are enabling your game or level designers to create the content for the game maps in this editor, which in many cases will be way simpler, way quicker, and of the same level of complexity like tools like Unreal or Unity. So you are spinning up your internal processes. Later on, you will polish these tools and put them as an in-game, obviously, tools, yes, but for the communities, external communities, so for your players. Another idea or approach.
Yeah, I would add to it that, I agree with some point here that, like, if modding is like a requirement for your game, then you should think about it from early on. If it's not, then it's more of a question, because inevitably it's going to add a lot to your workflow, a lot more work to your entire project. So it's not something that you should go into lightly, but yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, good here. Question. I think it will be the last one. Yeah, it will be the last one.
They will allow it.
I have a discussion with a friend a lot of times about what is. Wait, I need to focus.
It's hard at this time.
Is easy support for making mods beneficial for the community? I mean,
In
because
what
if
sense?
the support for making mods is, if it is too easy to make mods, there will be a lot of trash mods.
I understand. A way that, by default stuff is hidden, and then somebody goes through it and maybe, evaluates it. So it's kind of a two spectrum, right? Like either it's more of a social network and we are relying on people to boost, kind of signal boost the stuff that's high quality, or you're trying to maybe have a more curated approach where you are hoping that people who are like experts, maybe they will kind of let's say self-select themselves just because of the technological barrier. But ultimately, I would say a lot of creative people who can ship very high quality stuff are maybe not equally competent in, like, from the technological standpoint. Even game designers commonly, they struggle with scripting tools that are maybe meant to be easier. They can be put off by the textual scripting. So I wouldn't say that it's basically a trade-off. Our approach is to try to make it accessible and maybe rely on signal boosting. So that's how I would say it.
Okay.
Thank you. So, I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're free.